This is the Doc and Krueger cast, the official podcast of Doc and Krueger Games. Season 1, Episode 1, The Roll With It System, audiobook. The Roll With It system, designed by Adam Doc Bracken and Chris Krueger for the podcast Roll With It, from the crew at backward-compatible.com. Read by Adam Doc Bracken and Chris Krueger. The Roll With It system, version 1.0, is licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution Share-alike 4.0 international license. The podcasts Roll With It and Backward Compatible are trademarks of backward-compatible.com. All rights reserved.
Introduction. The Roll With It system is a diceless, narrative-driven, tabletop role-playing game for 2 to 5 players, including a game master. The rules are lightweight and designed to enable fast-paced, improvised, episodic storytelling. Players determine the outcomes of scenes using note cards they create, strengthen, and possibly destroy throughout the game. Each card represents an aspect of their character and influences how they develop over time. We have a few tags we like to use to describe what sort of system this is. Collaborative. Though the GM will put obstacles in the protagonist's way to help generate conflict, their job is neither to beat the players nor to carry them through a meticulously pre-planned scenario. Instead, the objective is for the GM and the players to work together to tell an entertaining story, which will call for improvisation and creative contributions from everyone at the table. Cinematic. This isn't what we'd call a crunchy game. The rules are streamlined and geared to facilitate storytelling, to keep the narrative moving forward. Your character is defined more by you, the player, than a list of skills and attributes, and the system is more concerned with the outcomes of scenes than of individual actions. Within each scene, you're free to play your character however you wish and convey the action with exactly the amount of detail and flair you desire, or don't. Diceless. The outcomes of scenes are not determined by dice rolls, but instead by the strategic use of note cards that represent your character's influence on the story. Incidentally, these note cards double as the closest thing this system has to a character sheet. Generic. This game has no built-in or prescribed setting. It can be used to tell any kind of story, with any tone and in any genre. You may import a setting you already know or create one on your own. It's up to you. What's with the name? We originally designed this game for our audio drama and actual play podcast Roll With It at backward-compatible.com, in which our cast uses RPGs as a framework for improvised storytelling. We feature a number of excellent RPGs on our show, and each is compelling in its own way. However, we also wanted a proprietary option, designed with our play styles and the show's episodic format in mind, that would draw out more of what we like to hear and Roll With It, in-character dialogue, and descriptions of action, and less of what we tend to trim down in post-production, talk of numbers, dice, and rules. This game helps us do that, and it's proven to be a fun and flexible system to use in our personal campaigns too. In a lot of ways, this game plays out like an episodic TV show, radio drama, comic book, or similar story format. At its best, it facilitates compelling conflicts that engage multifaceted, dynamic characters. Of course, the protagonists in any of our favorite stories will find things don't always go according to plan, and the ups and downs of all memorable narrative types are hardwired into Roll With It. When their characters are inevitably met with hardships and failures, players are encouraged to, roll with it, to embrace them as opportunities to make their characters and the narrative more interesting. Roll With It isn't about gaming the system, it's about coming together to tell a great story. And if you're anything like us, you'll have a lot of fun doing it. We hope you enjoy.
If you made the system for your show, does that mean I can't use it on mine? By no means. In fact, we'd be flattered if you did. We designed this game to help make it easy and fun for us to tell improvised stories, and we wanted to share it because we thought fellow role players like you might like it for the same reasons we do. At one point, we even considered changing the name just to be sure no one would worry about that, but we kept it because, ultimately, it began and ended as the game that we made for our show. So, just as we feature other games we enjoy on Roll With It, you're more than welcome to play and even hack our game for your own campaigns, whether you plan to feature them on your podcast or stream, or just enjoy them privately with friends. And if you feel like sharing, we'd love to hear about what you do with the game, so let us know.
About this book. This game doesn't have a ton of rules. However, because the rules are somewhat loose and open-ended, there are some nuances that may take some getting used to when you first start playing. That's why, for most of this book, we'll list the rules in their simplest form on the left-hand column. On the right, we'll share things that may help you understand the game better, but aren't rules per se.
For example, when you play a scene, there are only so many hard and fast rules about what you're required to do and when. And as with all tabletop RPGs, even those rules can be bent. Beyond that, though, there are many different ways you might choose to approach scenes. We'll suggest a few that have worked well for us, but the one you decide to use might vary from game to game, or even from scene to scene, based on the group you're playing with, the story you're telling, and the specific circumstances of the moment. You might even find a totally different solution that we don't mention at all. When that happens, we encourage you to use it. We think one of the greatest things about RPGs is their flexibility, so please don't let our rules get in the way of your story and your fun. Rather than bogging down the rules with extra commentary, examples, and alternative approaches, we thought we'd use this design to make it easier for you to just find the next step in the process when referring to this rulebook during play. Because in this audiobook we're reading the parenthetical information right after the paragraph that prompts it, feel free to scrub and find Doc's voice when you want just the rules, and my voice when you want to hear the extra commentary.
You'll also find occasional sidebars in gray boxes. These are usually examples of play or other extras. On the next page, you'll find a quick run-through of the game's cycle of play. Don't worry if there are some terms you don't understand yet. It's mainly there to let you get a sense of the big picture before we go into more detail. You can also refer to it when you need a quick reminder of how things work during play.
New to role-playing games? We do our best in this book to help newcomers understand how tabletop RPGs work, or at least to this game. But some of what we talk about assumes at least some background knowledge on the part of the reader. Please don't let any technical-sounding jargon deter you. Role-playing can be an incredibly fun and rewarding hobby, and we're excited to welcome you into the fold. While the best way to learn, always, is to find a game and start playing, there are many well-produced and entertaining examples of play that can give you a sense of what it's like, and some even include primers on the basics of role-playing. Here are just a few of the shows we could recommend to introduce you. One Shot by James D'Amato, an often comedic podcast featuring self-contained adventures run in a variety of systems. Titan's Grave by Geek and Sundry, a science fantasy series run in the Fantasy Age system. Critical Role by Geek and Sundry, an ongoing weekly Dungeons & Dragons livestream.
The cycle of play. A Roll With It system campaign, or series if you prefer, consists of one or more seasons.
Many campaigns need only one season to tell their stories, but if you find you want to explore your story further or revisit it after a hiatus, you may play a new season to do so. While it sometimes makes sense to imply time gaps between episodes, or even scenes within a given season, it's often even more natural to have some time pass between seasons, so feel free. You might take advantage of this to approach your characters or the story differently than you did before. Also, there's no rule saying you can't change your cast of characters between seasons, so feel free to work with the GM to introduce new characters or entirely new parties.
A season consists of 12 episodes.
You may make each of your seasons longer or shorter to suit your story, but we found it's almost always best to decide on a number of episodes ahead of time so the group can build to a satisfactory conclusion by the end. We like using 12 episodes because it mirrors a format some TV series follow, and because it allows the PCs time to develop without becoming too overpowered. Though elements of the narrative will carry over between seasons, the transition also allows for something of a mechanical reset. This serves not only to keep things balanced, but also to sharpen the focus of each PC's development and allow room for new, fresh growth.
An episode consists of 5 scenes.
It's likely you'll play multiple episodes in a row during any given night of gaming. A typical session could be a half or maybe even a whole season. The number of episodes in a season and seasons in a series can be adjusted to your liking, but the number of scenes per episode should remain at 5. It's important to the game's flow and balance. An episode will ideally contain a complete narrative, even if it's short and simple. You might think of each episode of play like an episode of a TV show. Be aware of which scene you're on and work together to reach some sort of resolution, or cliffhanger, by the end of the final scene. Of course, some conflicts, or story arcs, may take more than one episode to work through. So while you'll always want to conclude an episode in a satisfying or compelling way, you can also tack on a to be continued when needed.
A scene plays out in this sequence. The GM sets the stage. One PC opens the scene by playing a card face up and announcing their intention or question. The GM sets the obstacle by playing one or two cards. The first must be played face down. The second is optional, but must be played face up. PCs describe their characters' actions and speak in character to play out the scene narratively. They may also choose to make certain optional moves. PCs who did not open the scene may play a card face up to enter and announce their angle to assist or hinder the opening PC. Whenever a PC enters, the GM may optionally answer each new card with one from their hand face up to increase the obstacle. The PC who opened may play a card face up to self-assist. The GM may not answer this card. At the end of the scene, the lower value card returns to the opening player's hand and does not increase its star value. This is the one exception to the usual rules. The GM moves to close the scene. This is the last call for PCs to enter or self-assist. The GM mechanically closes the scene. Before calculating the result, they may choose to reveal their face-down card or return it to their hand. With the final obstacle determined, the PCs have one last opportunity to use abandonments or epiphanies to alter the outcome. Narrate the final outcome of the scene based on the mechanical outcome. This will generally be a brief statement of what happens, perhaps with a short exchange between the characters before moving on to the next scene. The GM and PCs perform all appropriate housekeeping tasks between scenes and between episodes, then proceed to the next scene or episode. Setup. To play, you will need plenty of note cards and something to write with.
We recommend using 3-inch by 5-inch note cards, with one or both sides unruled, but you could use anything that has a fairly uniform appearance from card to card. The important thing is to be able to flip all the cards and not tell between them. In a pinch, though, you could grab whatever printer or notebook paper is on hand, fold it up, and tear it into roughly same-sized pieces. The show must go on. Ideally, whatever you're writing with will be bold enough for everyone at the table to be able to read it at a glance without it bleeding through the note card. Again, you'll want to avoid giving away what's on the card when it's flipped. If the cards have only one side that is ruled, choose a side you won't write on for consistency's sake. On most note cards, just about any bold marker should be fine as long as you don't write too heavily. You might also consider using highlighters. On thinner or more translucent paper, it may be best to make do with pencils or other light writing tools.
A game master, GM, is always required. They will facilitate the game, make sure the rules are enforced as needed, or allow for exceptions, and convey what's going on in the game world. This includes playing as most or all non-player characters, NPCs. You will also need 3 to 4 players, each of whom will play as a player character, PC.
You could play with more than 4 PCs, but the game might feel overcrowded. The rules are designed to make sure that, most of the time, everyone will get at least one spotlight scene per episode. With more than 4 players, that might not always happen, so you'll want to be mindful of that and be sure to share screen time. There are special rules when playing with only 1 or 2 PCs. Each episode will consist of 3 scenes instead of the usual 5. If there's only 1 PC, the player will have 10 stars to work with during character creation. They still have a minimum hand size of 3 cards and a maximum hand size of 6.
Note: for the purposes of these rules, the GM is not considered a player. The phrase any player, therefore, means any player who is not the GM. Decide as a group what sort of story you want to tell, including the setting, tone, genre, and whether anyone has any elements or themes in particular they do or do not wish to be present in your game. The GM will take 3 note cards, making sure to leave one side completely blank, write GM on all of them, plus the numeral 0 on one, 1 star on one, and 2 stars on one. These 3 cards are unchanging and will be the GM's starting hand at the beginning of every episode. GM cards do not represent a character, and unlike PC cards, will never have a motif written on them. Character creation. After deciding what sort of character they want to play, each player will spend stars to generate the note cards that will help define their character.
If you're familiar with RPGs, you might have an approach to character creation that's at least somewhat affected by the skills or traits you can afford and how you imagine your PC will play mechanically. That's not a bad thing, we do it ourselves. But for this game, we encourage you to think of your PC first and foremost as a character in a story, not a game. Don't feel constrained by anything other than your creativity. Just work with the GM to make sure your character makes sense, or can be made to make sense, within your setting. If you're not sure who you want to play, see who your group's playing, then fill in whatever gap you find interesting. You might also bounce ideas off your GM, see what gets you both excited, and go with that.
Each player has 6 stars to work with. They must spend them all before the game begins. A star may be spent in one of 2 ways. Create a new card, add 1 star to an existing card. New PC cards always start with a star value of 0, denoted simply by the absence of stars. Do not write 0 on a PC card. On each new card, the player will write a motif.
A motif is a word or phrase that reflects your character's background, their personality, a skill, a goal, a relationship, either PC or NPC, an important signature item, a saying, a belief, or anything else you want to highlight in their story. You could even write down a theme or idea you want to explore. As the name suggests, motifs will naturally become recurring elements in your story. They'll play into most or all scenes in which your character appears, but they don't need to be on the nose. In fact, subtlety will probably be more fun and interesting in most cases. If a motif is something tangible, feel free to interpret it in a different light each time it appears. If it's a theme or idea, find different ways to communicate it or explore different perspectives around it. Get creative. For example, the motif sailor could call on skills or knowledge from the PC's sailing background in one scene, and then in another, explore what sailing and the sea mean to them. Later, you might contrast that outlook against those of other PCs or NPCs.
The player will also write their character's name in the corner of each new card. As the GM did, players should be sure to write on only one side of any card. Each player is required to start the game with at least 3 cards. They may not have more than 6. The maximum star value for a card is 3 stars.
Having more cards with lower star values will give your character a lot of screen time early in the game, but you'll likely lose many of those scenes. That can be narratively interesting, but if this is your first time playing, we recommend starting with just 3 cards and distributing your remaining stars across those.
Each player may only have 1 3-star card in the game at a time, either in their hand, in the GM's hand, or discarded. The maximum value for the rest of that player's cards is 2 stars until the 3-star card is destroyed, that is torn up and removed from the game permanently, by either an epiphany or an abandonment. Setting the stage. Role-playing is a conversation. On a fundamental level, almost every tabletop RPG, this game included, is a conversation between the GM and the rest of the players. As a matter of course, this conversation takes place during all phases of the game. It can and will be both formal and informal, structured and unstructured.
Alternatively, an RPG could be described as a more structured form of improv acting, where the players are actors and the GM is a host, mediator, and sometimes fellow actor. This metaphor is especially useful for improvisational, story-focused games like Roll With It. We would also say the GM can be thought of as a sort of director. They will often have the clearest idea of what's going on in the world and where the story is headed, so it's up to them to keep things cohesive and drive the narrative forward if things begin to stall. While everyone will be contributing their own ideas, and the PC's actions should most definitely affect the trajectory of the story, the GM is always the final authority if ever there's a call to be made. Listen well, work together, and find the balance that works best for your group and the story you want to tell.
The GM describes what's going on in the game world, then asks the players, explicitly or implicitly, "What do you do?" In response, the players speak as their characters or describe what their characters are doing, then the GM describes how the world reacts to their words or actions, and the cycle repeats. Depending on each participant's preferences, the conversation may happen in character, primarily through first-person dialogue, or be out of character, describing what's happening in the second or third person, and may sometimes transition seamlessly between the two modes. The conversation may also veer into topics outside of the story that may nevertheless affect it, however directly or indirectly. These topics might include the rules of the game, what the participants think about the story, and what they think they should do next. Narration before and between scenes. Before a scene is opened in a formal, mechanical sense, the GM will establish what's going on in the story so the PCs can react to it, possibly introducing a conflict, threat, or obstacle that might drive the PCs to action or keep them from getting what they want. Again, this may be done in character, out of character, or both.
If this phase of play is happening between scenes, it may be difficult to tell where the close of the previous scene ends and the setup for the next scene begins. This is normal and totally acceptable. If it helps you not to think about where to draw the line, don't.
As a part of this process, the GM may choose to ask the players questions about the PC's backgrounds or what they're doing, thinking, or feeling in the moment. The GM may also choose to let a player set the stage, perhaps giving a prompt for direction. A player may open a scene as soon as the GM feels it's appropriate.
Sometimes the players will wait until the GM finishes their setup and asks them what they'll do next, transparently inviting someone to open the scene. Other times, a player might interrupt, intentionally or not, to react to something the GM says. When this happens, the GM is free to react back as though in the middle of a scene. As a rule, roleplay isn't bound strictly to the formal confines of scenes. In fact, it's encouraged whenever and however it feels natural. If there is still more to set up following this interaction, the GM may have the players wait a bit longer before opening the scene. If, however, the GM is okay with treating a player's interruption as an organic scene opener, assuming the player is mechanically eligible to open the upcoming scene by having the most unplayed cards, they may declare that they are doing so and let the play proceed from there.
Opening a scene. Each scene will be opened by one and only one of the players.
Though other characters may be involved, every scene should spotlight the PC belonging to the player who opens it. At the very least, this should be an opportunity to point the camera at this character and keep them involved in the story, giving them some quality screen time. Whenever possible, use it to develop that character in some way, perhaps in light of their interactions with other characters, and let the proverbial audience learn more about them. When a player opens a scene, it is also an opportunity for them to take some ownership over the story and move it, at least for the moment, in a direction they want to see. Often, this will parallel their character's role in the narrative, but it can also be a way to work in some of the tonal and thematic elements that player wants to explore. The GM, the opening player, and the rest of the players should collaborate as much as possible to pursue the idea being introduced and make every scene awesome.
A player may never open a scene if any other player currently has more cards in their hand. If two or more players are tied for the most cards, they may decide amongst themselves who should open the scene.
A good rule of thumb is to go with whoever has the most compelling idea or the motif that best fits the situation. If no one can decide, the GM may choose someone.
The opening player must choose one card from their hand and place it face up on the table. The motif on that card should in some way tie into the player's intention for the scene.
Your intention will usually reflect what your character is trying to accomplish or a narrative question you're seeking to answer by the end of the scene. It is often best to have something specific and tangible, something that can succeed or fail, to make the mechanical result of the scene easier to translate into a narrative outcome. For example, I'm trying to open this door, or will my character be able to hold their tongue, might work better than something vague and open-ended like, I'm going to talk to this person, or what's going on here. However, an open-ended intention is sometimes the most sensible option, especially when there's no clear and immediate conflict or obstacle, or when the PC is trying to learn something they can't yet name. In these cases, the mechanical result of the scene might indicate, in a broad sense, whether things go well for the PC or whether things turn for better or for worse at the end of the scene.
If necessary, the GM may speak into the player's intention, reining them in if their intention is impossible, given the rules of the world, or if they're veering too far from the greater story or present situation. The GM must play one card from their hand face down. When the scene closes, this card may either be returned to the GM's hand or flipped. Flipping it would add its star value to the cumulative obstacle for the scene. Note: regardless of its true star value, while face down, a card is always treated as though it has a star value of 0. At this time, the GM may optionally play one additional card from their hand face up, adding its star value to the obstacle. This card cannot be withdrawn once played, nor may it be played for free later in the scene, though additional cards may be played when players enter the scene. Once the initial obstacle is set, the GM and opening player will proceed to play out the scene. Additional players may chime in if their PCs are involved narratively, but may not influence the outcome mechanically unless they enter the scene. Note: when adding a PC's card to the obstacle, the motif does not come into play, only the star value. However, the card's motif and owner may become relevant if an abandonment or epiphany is triggered. Entering a scene. Any character present in a scene may contribute narratively, but if a player wishes to enter a scene mechanically, they must play one card from their hand face up.
As we've mentioned, a scene should always spotlight the opening PC. While other PCs may speak and otherwise be involved as appropriate, it's often best practice to sit back and let the GM and opening player lead, to speak when spoken to, as it were. Entering mechanically gives other players a bit more license to influence the direction of the scene, though what they do and say, generally, should still be in response to the opening player's intention. Even if entering introduces inter-character conflict or drastically changes the tone, players should try to avoid introducing distracting non sequitur.
Upon entering a scene, the player will state their angle relative to the opening PC's intention. Assist. The entering PC will directly or indirectly help the opening PC succeed in their intention, adding their card's star value to that of the opening players. Hinder. The entering PC will directly or indirectly prevent the opening PC from succeeding in their intention, adding their card's star value to the obstacle established by the GM.
Feel free to stretch the definitions of assisting and hindering if the line starts to get fuzzy. Ultimately, even if an entering PC seems to be doing something completely unrelated to the opening PC's intention, it should almost always be possible to determine if the action is working for or against the PC in at least a narrative sense, if not necessarily a practical one. A player might move to hinder the opening player even though, in-game, their PC thinks they're helping. Inversely, a PC who thinks they're working against the opening PC might unwittingly be helping them succeed, making their angle assisting anyway. In some cases, the GM might even rule that, mechanically, the angle should be switched from what the player initially stated. We'll always recommend doing whatever you think your character would do, whatever is best for the story, and figuring out how to make it work mechanically after the fact. But if for whatever reason you feel too limited by the binary options, you might consider hanging on to the card you'd buy in with so you can follow up in a later scene all of your own.
A player may not change their angle in a scene after declaring it. If they wish to withdraw their star value from their chosen side, they may only do so via an abandonment. Just as the opening card's motif should play into the opening player's intention for the scene, the motif on the entering PC's card should somehow play into the entering player's angle. Multiple players may enter a scene, each with only one card, as long as each player has a card to spare. A player may not enter a scene using the last card remaining in their hand, unless it is the final scene of the episode.
Because a player may only play a given card once per episode, using cards to enter may mean they don't get to open any scenes. It's a trade-off between having a lot of secondary screen time and possibly having less time, but in the spotlight. Neither way is inherently better, but it's something to keep in mind.
Each time a player enters a scene, the GM may optionally answer the new card by playing any single card from their hand face up, increasing the obstacle. The star value on that card is added to the obstacle. Self-assists. At any point during a scene, the opening player may optionally self-assist by playing a second card from their hand face up. This adds the card's star value to that of the card they opened with. The opening player may alternatively use this second card to self-hinder, adding the card's star value to the GM's obstacle.
Why would anyone want to self-hinder? There are a number of possible reasons, but the two we've seen most often are these. First, the player actually wants to lose the scene because, narratively, they want their character to want something and be denied, or because, mechanically, a loss would add a star to a card they want to strengthen. Second, something may change during a scene that suddenly causes the player to want their side to lose. Since intentions and angles are set once declared, the player might self-hinder to keep some offending party from benefiting from a success.
Note, throughout this book, the term self-assist may generally be taken to mean either self-assist or self-hinder. In either case, the motif on the card should play into what the PC is doing narratively in the scene. Unlike when additional players enter a scene, the GM may never answer the opening player's self-assist or self-hinder with an additional card of their own.
GMs have the option to answer so players don't just overwhelm every obstacle with sheer numbers. Even if no one enters, though, the GM may always opt to play 2 cards against the opening player's 1. The self-assist, in a sense, is the opening player's opportunity to answer the GM's second obstacle card and to level the playing field. That's why the GM can't answer back against a self-assist.
Because one of their 2 cards will return to their hand at the end of the scene, the opening player is permitted to self-assist or self-hinder with the last remaining card in their hand during any scene.
For every move, a beat. Throughout this book, we've said the motif on a card should somehow play into what the character's doing in a scene when the card is played. This is actually a universal philosophy that ought to be applied in all phases of the game. Whenever possible, we strongly encourage you to reflect what happens outside the narrative, inside the narrative. The game's rules and the moves that players make are what drive the story. Both sides of the coin, mechanics and narrative, are intrinsically intertwined, so embrace that. Playing a card to enter or self-assist means making a decision or taking an action. Increasing the obstacle means new and greater resistance to what the players are trying to accomplish. Destroying a card means a drastic, permanent change in a character moving forward. Be creative. Stay adaptable. Let every rule inform your narrative and vice versa. Give every move meaning. You're more than your motifs. At the end of the day, all RPGs are frameworks for the collaborative storytelling your table will do by role-playing. But as redundant as that might sound, it's easy to get caught up in the rules of the game and start seeing your character as a mere collection of mechanisms that should be used in some optimal way to achieve an end. While there's definitely a place for that mindset in RPGs, we find it to be limiting if taken too far. Motifs are not containers that permit you to say or do certain things. They're icons that evoke the person they signify. We urge you to let the full depth and experience of your character emerge through you in play. If an event in their background, an aspect of their personality, a skill or ability, or an unexpected reaction comes to mind that isn't reflected by the cards in your hand, don't hold it back. If it seems a contradiction, that's fine. People are complex, conflicted creatures. Remember that your cards are defined by your character and what they're capable of, never the other way around.
Closing a scene. When the GM feels it is appropriate, they will move to close the scene. Announcing this gives the players one final opportunity to enter the scene or self-assist.
Beyond the rules themselves, the way in which you handle the rules during play can be leveraged to interesting effect. For instance, in a tense, quick-thinking situation, the GM might allow very little time to react after moving to close a scene. The player's hesitation might be translated into their character's hesitation, and the GM may call the scene closed, forcing the players to destroy cards if they want to alter the final outcome.
When there are no players remaining who wish to play additional cards, the GM may choose to either reveal their face-down card, adding its star value to the final obstacle, or return it to their hand.
For the GM, hand management is a big part of controlling the difficulty of the game, or the narrative tension if you prefer. Rather than feeling they need to win every scene, they might withhold cards, play lower value cards, or feint with their face-down cards to build to their hand and make key scenes more challenging later in the episode. In other cases, the GM might push hard to win earlier scenes, especially if they can get multiple players to buy in, because a loss for the players means their cards get powered up as they enter the GM's hand, making them a greater benefit for the GM than the players in the short term.
The opening player's final star value is the sum of the stars on their opening card, their self-assist card, if applicable, any cards that enter to assist, if applicable. The GM's final obstacle is the sum of the stars on their flipped opening card, if applicable, their second opening card, if applicable, their cards played in answer to cards played by players entering the scene, if applicable, the opening player's self-hinder card, if applicable, any cards that entered to hinder the opening player, if applicable. Once the final obstacle and star values are established, the scene is mechanically closed. However, at this point, players may optionally use epiphanies or abandonments, if allowed, to alter the outcome. Unless there is an epiphany, compare the final star value to the final obstacle. If the final star value is higher, the opening player wins the scene. If the obstacle is higher, the GM wins. If there is a tie, the GM chooses who wins. Based on the mechanical outcome, the GM may narrate what happens, allow the player to narrate, or both. The GM always has the authority to rein in the player if necessary, and will always have the final say.
To give players more control over their characters and let their creative inputs enrich the story, we like to let players narrate their own successes and failures whenever possible. A good rule of thumb for when to do this is to determine if they're learning something or doing something. Learning something is often the result, if not the aim, of scenes with open-ended intentions. Here, it's often best for the GM to narrate, as the player won't know the information the character is looking for, or is now finding out even if they weren't looking for it. Sometimes the discovery will be some new development, good or bad might depend on who won the scene, that leads into the next scene. Scenes with specific intentions often find a PC trying to do something. Letting the player narrate, perhaps with some direction or additional input from the GM, lets them characterize through the way in which their character succeeds or fails.
When the scene is mechanically and narratively closed, set the stage for the next scene. Or, if this was the final scene, reset for a new episode. Abandonments and epiphanies. Abandonments and epiphanies may only be triggered once per player per scene. A player may not trigger both an abandonment and an epiphany in a scene.
Officially, abandonments and epiphanies are triggered between closing the scene and narrating the final outcome. However, it is permissible, and delightfully dramatic, for a player to destroy a card during the narration, particularly if it's a last-ditch reaction to prevent something they don't want to happen. If it's too late to make a difference, say if you're playing in real time and won't allow retcons when someone does this, the GM may have certain outcomes stand, but should still acknowledge the move, making whatever changes or concessions they can within reason.
In the event that both abandonments and an epiphany are triggered in the same scene, the epiphany must always be triggered last. Abandonments. An abandonment may be triggered by any player who opened or entered a scene. One of the cards belonging to the player in question must have been played face up, either by the GM or the player themselves, before the scene was closed. An abandonment destroys the card in question, reducing the final star value or obstacle, whichever it was originally played toward, by the amount of stars that were on the card. This may affect the final outcome of the scene.
Abandonments and epiphanies play an important role in character development. Consider using them not just when you need to win a scene, but also when it's simply the best thing for the story. Some of our most memorable moments playing the Roll With It system have come from abandonments that didn't actually affect the outcome of the scene, yet fundamentally changed a character and thus the story.
The motif on the card being destroyed should somehow tie into what happens narratively when the abandonment is triggered.
Narratively, an abandonment often means the character, in a dramatic or subtly significant moment, is ending, swearing off, giving up, walking away from, or denouncing the motif in question. At least for now, if not permanently. This should be reflected in the way the character is played moving forward.
Epiphanies. Only the opening player for a scene may trigger an epiphany in that scene. The opening player's 3-star card must have been played face up, either by the GM or the opening player themselves, before the scene was closed. An epiphany destroys the card in question, but results in an automatic win by the opening player for that scene, regardless of the final star value or obstacle. The motif on the card being destroyed should somehow tie into what happens narratively when the epiphany is triggered. Triggering an epiphany earns the player one extra star to work with after the current episode is over.
Narratively, an epiphany means the character, in a climactic moment, is having some sort of breakthrough, realization, or change in perspective related to the motif in question. Even more so than an abandonment, it should substantially change them as a character, and be reflected in the way they're played moving forward. Players will often make epiphanies positive, sometimes a sort of ultimate move they've been building toward, but they can just as easily signal a negative change in the character. Consider researching epiphanies as a literary concept and see if that inspires you. While not strictly required, we recommend spending the bonus star to create a new card with a motif that somehow reflects the implications of the epiphany.
Between scenes. Before beginning a new scene, the GM must discard any of the face-up cards they played during the previous scene. They are now out of play until the reset between episodes, when they will all return to the hands of their respective owners. All face-up cards played by players during the scene are added to the GM's hand. There is no limit to the GM's hand size. If the GM won the scene, the opening player and any players who entered the scene to assist will each add 1 star to the card they played. Any players who entered to hinder do not add a star, since their side won. If the opening player won the scene, they do not add a star, nor do any players who entered to assist. Any players who entered the scene to hinder will each add 1 star to the card they played, since their side lost.
There's an inherent mechanical benefit in entering a scene to hinder the opening player. If the opening player wins the scene, the entering player earns 1 star for the card they played. If the opening player loses, they'll earn 1 star, which will still be beneficial to the entering player in the long term if all the PCs are basically on the same team, though that's not always a given. Whoever wins, hindering introduces conflict between PCs, which translates into narrative interest. So, unless you have players who will take it personally, which is an entirely separate issue, you should never be afraid to hinder, especially when that's what your character would do in that situation.
If the opening player self-assisted during the scene and lost, even if this was a result of self-hindering, they will add 1 star to one of the 2 cards they played. Which one is their choice, unless one of the cards can't take on any more stars, in which case it will go on the one that can, assuming that one is not also at its limit.
Self-assisting is an effective way to strengthen low-powered cards while continuing to take advantage of those cards which are mechanically strong or narratively more central to your character's story arc. And by playing those less used cards, you're able to maintain a sense of depth and narrative interest for your character that might be lacking if you were to only hit on the same 1 or 2 motifs. That's also why you can only play the same card once per episode. One-note characters have their place, but it's generally good for a story's protagonists, some if not all of the PCs, to be well-rounded.
Reminder: the star value on any card may never exceed 3 stars, and each player may only have 1 3-star card in the game at any given time. If a star cannot be added to a card at this time, it is forfeit and cannot be spent later. Win or lose, the opening player must give either their opening or their self-assist card to the GM, whichever has the higher star value. If there is a tie, the player chooses. The remaining card returns to their hand.
PCs as supporting characters. In many RPG campaigns, it's natural that one of the PCs will take on a central role in the plot, in a sense becoming the protagonist, while the other PCs fall into supporting roles. This isn't an inherently bad thing, and in fact, it mirrors a great many stories that tend to focus on one or a few lead characters, even when they have a large and varied cast. The role of this system is designed to make sure all players get at least some screen time, thereby keeping everyone involved. At the outset of a campaign, it can be hard to tell how things will pan out, but if you should find yourself in what feels like a supporting role, embrace that as your contribution to the greater story. For instance, if your PC disapproves of the lead PC's actions, then your PC can serve as a valuable counterpoint, adding depth.
Between episodes. When an episode ends, all cards, except any that were destroyed, return to the hands of their respective owners. Each player is given 1 star, plus any bonus star they might have earned for triggering an epiphany. As in character creation, a star can be spent at this point to create a new card, up to a maximum of 6 in a player's hand, add 1 star to an existing card, up to a maximum of 3 stars, 2 stars if the player already has a 3-star card in the game.
Motifs that have seemingly nothing to do with your present situation can make for interesting fish-out-of-water subplots if nothing else. But there are also cases where a motif just doesn't get used much, plain and simple. If you have room in your hand, creating a new card with a new motif is a great way to adapt to what the story has shaped up to be so far. You can use the better-fitting one more often while you wait to see if the other becomes valuable later. If it doesn't, you can always abandon it.
If a player's hand is full, they may not purchase a new card. If a player has fewer than 3 cards in their hand, they must spend as many stars as is required to bring their starting hand size up to 3 with new cards. Any stars remaining after that may be spent as they please. In the event that a player does not have enough stars to reach the minimum starting hand size of 3, they must spend all the stars they have available on cards first, then take free cards to get them up to the minimum requirement of 3 cards. These cards will have a beginning star value of 0. Players who have a maxed out hand, 1 card with 3 stars and 5 with 2 stars, cannot spend their stars on anything, and will forfeit their available stars for this episode. These cannot be spent later.
This system is designed to promote churn, to encourage players to evolve their characters over time as they destroy older motifs during play, then create new ones. Nothing can force you to make changes to a maxed out hand if you're content with it, but you may find the story to be more interesting if you do, not to mention the mechanical benefits. Consider using your 3-star card to win a key scene rather than hanging on to it for the perfect moment that may not come. And never be afraid to abandon something, especially if you're not using it. An epiphany or abandonment that comes about organically, and a moment where winning or losing a scene really matters, will often play better and have a greater impact than a premeditated moment that gets shoehorned in at an ill-fitting time.
Players may choose to spend none or only some of their available stars, even if their hand is not maxed out. However, any unspent stars are forfeit and cannot be saved or spent later.
Where to take the story? Some GMs will come in with an idea of roughly where they want the story to end. Others embrace not knowing and will let the story come together naturally as time goes on. Whatever your style, it's always a good idea to see how the players have been playing and respond to them. Build on their good ideas, and if they're starting to take things too far off the rails for your taste, find creative ways not to drag them back in, but to draw them in with what seems to motivate them. Players, try to develop your own ideas while also building on what the GM and your fellow players are doing. If someone did something you liked, the space between episodes is a great time to let them know, and discuss how you might be able to play off each other moving forward.
Season finales. After the last scene of the last episode in a season, the group may optionally go through the season finale process to close a season and prepare for the next season, should there be one.
This allows for a mechanical reset between seasons and provides a sense of closure, acting as a teaser, epilogue, or perhaps the denouement if you didn't get it in the final episode. However, if you feel the final episode wrapped things sufficiently, don't feel obligated to go through this process. Alternatively, you could have a more free-form, narrative-only finale that ignores the mechanical process of destroying cards to earn stars.
Depending on the group's preferences, this process may be purely mechanical or played out narratively in an extra scene, where each mechanical move has a narrative output as in the rest of the game. In whatever order they feel appropriate, each player will destroy a card in their hand, one by one, until no one has any cards remaining. Each time a card is destroyed, its owner may do one of 2 things. Transfer the motif to a new card that will be created for the next season. This new card begins with a star value of 0, regardless of its value when destroyed. Retire the motif. This earns the player 1 star that can be spent in one of 2 ways, as in standard character creation. Create a new card, add 1 star to an existing card.
Ending the season with few cards may lead to being relatively underpowered at the beginning of the next season. Even ending with a full hand leaves you with just the 6 stars you'd have for character creation. Take advantage of this in your narrative. A new story brings with it new challenges for which the PCs might not be as prepared, and having a less powerful hand of cards will likely mirror that early in the story.
Note: if this approach is used, it replaces the standard character creation process that would be used to start a new series. If this approach is not used, players may recreate their characters using the standard character creation process. Players may destroy their cards in any order they please, and it is permissible for any given player to destroy multiple cards in a row. If the group chooses to play out this process narratively, the motif on each card that is destroyed should have something to do with what is happening narratively, speaking to what the motif has come to mean throughout the season or hinting at what it could mean to the story moving forward. The extra scene for the season finale could end up playing out similarly to a standard scene, more like a montage, or anything in between. The GM will not speak into this process except at the player's request, possibly providing an NPC's reaction to something or to rein in a player if necessary.
Failure doesn't mean incompetence. It's important to remember that losing a scene doesn't necessarily mean a PC had an uncharacteristic moment of incompetence, failing or losing where you'd never say they would if it weren't for the cards telling you they did. A PC might do everything right, performing just as well as you'd expect, and the thing that causes them to lose the scene is some factor beyond their control. It could even be that the character doesn't fail at all. Maybe they succeed with flying colors, but there's an unexpected consequence that comes about as a result. If the GM wants to be especially devious, they might even conceal that until it rears its ugly head somewhere down the road. In the Roll With It system, one generally shouldn't associate star value or hand size with the PC's competence or level of ability. What happens narratively, on screen, will always come down to description. When in doubt, use common sense. In the same scenario, a failure by a novice will look very different from a failure by a master, and they'll probably have very different narrative implications to boot. This has been the audio rulebook for the Roll With It system. For examples of play, additional tips, and frequently asked questions, please see the PDF version of the rules available on our website, docandkrueger.com.